A folded piece of paper slid across my kitchen table, my mother's handwriting. I had not seen it in 9 years, but I would have recognized those sharp, slanted letters from across a crowded room. 4 items, numbered neatly, each one more unthinkable than the last. The fourth demand mentioned my daughter by name. My hands did not shake. Something far worse happened. They went completely still. That moment, that single piece of paper on a Tuesday afternoon in October, was the beginning of the end of a silence that had stretched across nearly a decade. But to understand how a mother could walk into her own son's home after 9 years of nothing and slide a list of demands across the table like a contractor submitting an invoice, I need to take you back to the very beginning. My name is Thomas Mitchell. I am 67 years old. I live in a town called Cedar Hollow, Virginia, population just under 3,000 on a good day. I drive a 1991 Ford pickup, dark green, with a dent in the tailgate I have never bothered to fix. My golden retriever, Bo, rides shotgun every morning when I drive to Millie's Diner on the corner of Oak and 2nd. 2 eggs, over easy, rye toast, black coffee. Millie knows not to talk to me until I have had my first cup. I sit at the same booth by the window where the morning sun hits the table, and I can watch the town wake up without anybody asking me questions. After breakfast, I go home and I build furniture, chairs and bookshelves and small tables for people who want something made by hand. My workshop smells like cedar and linseed oil and sawdust that never fully settles. My neighbors think I am just a retired carpenter who keeps to himself. They see me fix a fence post and they figure that is the whole story. It is not, but I have never corrected them. Before Cedar Hollow, I spent 26 years in the United States Army, military intelligence. I held a clearance level I am still not comfortable naming. 3 tours overseas, operations in places that did not appear on any public map. When I retired, I left that world behind completely. Told no one in Cedar Hollow. I wanted to build things with my hands instead of dismantling things with my mind. For a long time, that silence felt like the only honest thing I had left, because the person who had made silence feel like home, the person who had made everything feel like home, was gone. My wife Helen died 7 years ago, ovarian cancer, the slow kind, the kind that lets you watch. They found it late, and by then there was nothing to do but sit beside her and hold her hand while the months did what months do to a body that has already decided to leave. Helen was the strongest person I ever knew, stronger than any commanding officer I served under. She was a black woman from Richmond who grew up in a house with 6 siblings and a grandmother who cooked for all of them on a single stove. She knew things about people that I could never learn from any briefing, and she had a saying she repeated to me so many times that I can still hear her voice when I close my eyes. The truth about a person never hides forever, Thomas. You just have to be patient enough to let it show itself. She said that the first time I told her about my family. She said it again the year our daughter Grace was born. And she said it one last time in a hospital room with the monitors beeping and the fluorescent light humming above us, and her hands so thin in mine that I was afraid to squeeze. I did not fully understand what she meant until 9 years after my family disowned me. After Helen died, I learned what real silence sounds like. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that has weight. I would wake up and make 2 cups of coffee before remembering there was no one to hand the second one to. I would reach across the bed in the dark and feel nothing but cold sheets and the absence of someone who used to press her cold feet against my legs just to hear me complain. Bo would sit at the foot of the bed and look at me with those brown eyes like he understood. Dogs are better at grief than people. They do not try to fix it. They just stay. Grace kept me alive. Not in the dramatic way people say it in movies, in the quiet way. She would call me every Sunday. She would drive down from Richmond once a month and bring groceries I did not ask for and clean the kitchen I had not neglected, but that she cleaned anyway because it gave her an excuse to stay a few extra hours. She was 28 years old, an elementary school teacher, third grade. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown and steady, and my stubbornness, which Helen always said was the worst combination she could imagine. Grace was the only family I had left. And the reason I had no other family is a story I carried quietly for a very long time. When I married Helen 34 years ago, my family did not celebrate. My mother, Margaret, looked at me across the living room of the house I grew up in and said words I will never repeat because some sentences do not deserve to be spoken twice. My father, Richard, sat in his recliner and said nothing. His silence was a vote. My brother David stood in the hallway and stared at the floor. My Aunt Yvonne told me I was making a selfish decision that would ruin my children before they were even born. I stood in that living room and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart, something deeper, the foundation of everything I had believed about the people who raised me. I married Helen 4 months later. 11 people attended. The right side of the church was nearly empty. Helen's side was full. Her mother wept through the whole ceremony, good tears. Her father shook my hand, and I felt more fathered in that single moment than I had in 26 years under my own father's roof. My family did not come. They did not send a card. When Grace was born, I sent an announcement. Helen's name and mine and the baby's name and the weight, 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Nothing came back. I sent a photo the following Christmas. Grace in a red dress, smiling with no teeth, held by a woman whose name my mother refused to say. No call, no card. No acknowledgement that somewhere in the world a child existed with their blood. 9 years of that silence passed. 9 years in which my mother could have picked up the phone, could have written a letter, could have driven the 3 hours to Cedar Hollow and knocked on my door. She did none of those things. And then one day she did. But I am getting ahead of myself. If this story is already stirring something inside you, if you know what it feels like to love someone your own family refused to accept, I hope you will stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so that stories like this one keep reaching the people who need to hear them. Before my mother came back into my life, someone else came into it first. His name was Victor Hale. He was 37 years old, a real estate developer from Charlottesville who wore tailored coats and drove a silver car that looked like it had never touched a gravel road. He started seeing Grace about 14 months before the day that piece of paper landed on my kitchen table. I wanted to like him. I tried hard to like him. Grace brought him to dinner at my house on a Sunday evening in August, and he walked in with a bottle of wine and a handshake that lasted exactly the right amount of time, and a smile that I later realized never quite reached his eyes. He was good at people, the kind of good that is practiced. He asked about my workshop. He complimented the bookshelves. He told me the roast was excellent. Helen would have seen through him in 10 minutes. It took me longer, but the cracks showed eventually. They always do. The first time was at Thanksgiving. Grace brought Victor to dinner at her friend Clara's house. I was there. Clara's husband Nathan was there. A few neighbors. Nothing fancy. Turkey and sweet potatoes and rolls from the bakery on Main Street. Victor made a joke about the house. Small place, he said, looking around with that practiced smile. Cozy. The word cozy can be a compliment or an insult depending on who is saying it. I watched Nathan's wife, Sarah, glance at the floor. Nobody laughed. Victor did not notice. Or maybe he did and did not care. I said nothing. A man with a few rough edges is still a man. I had no right to judge him on a single word. The second time was at Christmas. Grace and Victor came to my house. He walked through the front door and paused in the entryway, looking at the framed photographs on the wall. There was one of Helen and me on our wedding day. He stared at it a moment too long. Nice picture, he said. Different times, right? I did not know what he meant by different times. I told myself it was nothing. My jaw tightened anyway. Grace was standing behind him. She glanced at me with a look I recognized. It was the same look Helen used to give me when she wanted me to let something go, so I let it go. The third time was harder to ignore. It was February. Grace called me on a Sunday, which was normal, but her voice was different. Thinner. She laughed too quickly at things that were not funny. She changed the subject every time I asked how things were going with Victor. I know what evasion sounds like. I spent 26 years listening for it in people whose lives depended on telling the truth. Grace was not telling me the truth. Not because she wanted to lie, because she was afraid of what the truth would cost her. I stared at the phone long after she hung up. Bo pressed his head against my knee. I sat there in the kitchen, listening to the clock tick, and I remembered what Helen used to say. The truth about a person never hides forever. You just have to be patient enough to let it show itself. The fourth time happened at Millie's Diner. Grace and Victor came through town on a Saturday and stopped for lunch. I met them there. Victor ordered a steak, and when the waitress, a young woman named Sophie, who had worked at Millie's since she was 17, brought it out and the temperature was not exactly what he wanted, he did not ask politely. He did not smile. He looked at her and said, "I asked for medium rare. This is medium," and his voice had a flatness to it that made Sophie's hands tremble when she picked up the plate. Grace looked down at the table. Her fingers tightened around her water glass. I watched Sophie walk back toward the kitchen with her shoulders drawn in. A man who speaks to a stranger with contempt will eventually speak to everyone that way. The only question is when. The fifth time was the one that kept me awake. Grace came to visit on a warm Saturday in March. She wore a long-sleeve shirt even though the temperature was above 70 degrees. When she reached across the table for the salt, her sleeve pulled up and I saw a mark on her wrist. Not large, not dramatic, but wrong. She caught me looking and pulled her sleeve down fast. "I burned myself on the stove," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes moved to the left. "I have spent a career reading faces." That was not the face of a woman who burned herself on the stove. My hands went flat on the table. Something inside me became very still. The kind of still that comes before a decision that cannot be undone. I did not say a word. Not yet. A man who acts before he understands the full picture makes mistakes, but a man who waits too long makes worse ones. I had no idea that within the next 2 weeks, everything in my quiet life was about to split wide open. Before I continue, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me which city you are watching from. I read every single one of them. Knowing you are out there listening to this keeps these stories alive. The detonating incident happened on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting on the porch with Bo. The air smelled like cut grass and honeysuckle, and the last light was fading behind the tree line. My phone rang. It was Grace. She was crying, not the quiet kind. The kind where the breath comes in fragments and the words do not land in order. "Dad, I need you to come get me," she said. "I am at the gas station on Route 12, please." I did not ask a single question. I grabbed my keys, put Bo inside, and drove. The gas station was 19 minutes away. I made it in 12. She was standing under the fluorescent lights with her arms wrapped around herself. Her lip was swollen. There was a redness on her cheek that would be purple by morning. She saw my truck and collapsed into the passenger seat, and I held her, and I felt something ancient and terrible and perfectly controlled wake up inside me. A part of me I had buried under sawdust and coffee and quiet mornings. The soldier. "He came to my house," she whispered. "He had been drinking. I told him I wanted some space, and she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. I drove her home. I made her tea. I put her in the guest room with a quilt Helen had made 20 years ago, a quilt with squares of blue and gold fabric that Helen had cut from old shirts and curtains, because she believed nothing should ever be wasted. I sat in my workshop that night with the door closed and the light off. The smell of cedar surrounded me. I opened the bottom drawer of the old oak desk that sat in the corner. Inside was a box. It had not been opened in years. My service medals, my old identification, letters from men I had served with, a photograph of Helen and me the day I came home from my last deployment. She was holding Grace, who was 3 months old. Helen's smile in that photograph was the purest thing I had ever seen. I closed the box. I sat in the dark and I heard Helen's voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. "The truth about a person never hides forever, Thomas. You just have to be patient enough to let it show itself." I was done being patient. The next morning I made a phone call, not to the police, not yet, to a man named Arthur Graves. Arthur had served with me for 12 years. He was now a private investigator in Richmond. He owed me nothing, but he owed me everything because I had carried him out of a building on fire in a country I still cannot name in 1989. Arthur, I said, I need you to run a background on someone for me. Full picture. Give me the name, he said. He did not ask why. That is how soldiers are. Victor Hale, Charlottesville, real estate. 2 days later, Arthur called me back. Thomas, he said, you're going to want to sit down for this. Victor Hale was not what he claimed to be. His real estate business was largely a front for a series of debt-loaded properties. He had been sued 3 times by former partners. He had a restraining order from a previous relationship that he had somehow gotten expunged. And then Arthur said the thing that made my blood go cold. Thomas, he said, your mother's name is Margaret Mitchell, correct? Maiden name Ashworth? Yes, I said. Victor Hale's mother was born Pauline Ashworth. She is your mother's first cousin. I stared at the wall of my workshop for a very long time. Victor Hale was family. My family. A family that had disowned me 9 years ago and had now sent a man into my daughter's life without telling her. Whether my mother had orchestrated it, or whether it was Yvonne or David or some other branch of the Ashworth tree, I did not yet know. But I knew this. Nothing about Victor's presence in Grace's life had been accidental. The courtship, the charm, the slow, careful way he had inserted himself. It was a plan. And Grace, my daughter, Helen's daughter, had been the target. I sat with that knowledge for 3 days. I did not call Grace. I did not confront Victor. I did not dial my mother's number. Instead, I prepared. I drove to Arthur's office in Richmond. He laid out everything on a metal desk in a room that smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. Documents, court filings, property records, a family tree connecting Victor Hale to Margaret Mitchell through 2 generations of Ashworths. What do you want to do with this? He asked. I want to end it, I said, not with anger, with truth. Arthur nodded. Then we do it clean, he said. No mess, just the facts laid out where nobody can deny them. I spent the next week building the case, not a legal case, a family case. I gathered every document and put them in a leather folder Helen had given me years ago. She used to keep recipes in it. I could still smell lavender on the leather. That Saturday, I called Grace. Come to dinner Sunday, I said. I'm making your mother's fried chicken. Is everything okay, Dad? It will be, I said, but first I had to do something I had not done in 9 years. I called my mother. The phone rang 4 times. She answered with a voice that sounded exactly the same. Every syllable measured, every word placed with the precision of a woman who had spent her entire life controlling every room she entered. Thomas, she said, as though 9 years had not passed, as though nothing had happened. As though the last time we spoke, I had not stood in her living room with my heart cracking while she told me I was dead to her for loving a woman she refused to see as human. Hello, Margaret, I said. I used her first name deliberately. I heard her breath catch. I would like you to come to dinner Sunday, I said. You and David and Yvonne. There is something we need to discuss as a family. The pause was so long I thought the line had gone dead. She spoke carefully. This is unexpected, she said. What changed? Nothing changed, I said. That is exactly the problem. She agreed. She agreed because she believed she was winning. She believed that after 9 years, I had finally come crawling back. She had no idea what was waiting. Sunday arrived. I woke early. I fed Beau. I drove to Millie's and sat in my booth and drank my coffee and watched the sun come through the window. I went home and cleaned the kitchen. I cooked Helen's fried chicken, dredged in buttermilk and seasoned with paprika and black pepper. I set the table for 6. Helen's chair remained empty. It always did. Grace arrived at 4. She looked better. The bruise on her cheek had faded to yellow. She hugged me in the doorway, and I held on a second longer than usual. She noticed but did not say anything. My mother arrived at 5. She brought David and Yvonne. David shook my hand without looking me in the eye. Yvonne walked in as though inspecting a property. My mother looked around the house, at the furniture I had built, the photographs of Helen on the wall, the evidence of a life she had refused to be part of. We sat down to eat. Grace served the chicken. She did not know why her grandmother was here. She did not know the connection between Victor and the Ashworth family. She sat across from Margaret and smiled with the open warmth that Helen had planted in her, like a seed that grew in spite of everything. The dinner was civil. My mother complimented the food. David talked about the weather. Yvonne asked Grace about teaching with a tone that almost sounded genuine. For one brief moment, I watched my mother look at Grace, really look at her, and something crossed her face that I had never seen before. It might have been regret. It might have been recognition. It might have been the understanding that this beautiful young woman, this teacher who cared for other people's children with patience and love, was the grandchild she had thrown away over the color of her mother's skin. But the moment passed. After the meal, over coffee and silence, my mother reached into her purse. She placed a folded piece of paper on the table. She unfolded it slowly with the careful movements of a woman who believed she was in control. "Thomas," she said, "I think it is time we discussed the future." "The future," I repeated. She nodded. "I have written down a few thoughts." First, she read, "I believe it is appropriate for us to re-establish a formal family relationship. I want regular access to my granddaughter." I said nothing. Second, "I have heard that you own considerable property here. I think it would be only fair for David to receive a share of the family land, since he was excluded from your father's will after Richard passed last year." Grace's face had gone very still. She was watching me. Third, "I expect an apology for the way you humiliated this family by eloping with that woman without our blessing." She looked up from the paper. "And fourth, there is a young man named Victor who I believe would be a very good match for Grace. He comes from a respectable family. Our family, in fact. I would like you to encourage that relationship." The kitchen went perfectly silent. I could hear the clock on the wall. I could hear Bo's breathing from the next room. I could hear the wind outside pressing against the old windows. Grace spoke first. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Victor," she said. "Victor's family." My mother looked at her with the patient expression of someone who does not understand why the obvious needs explaining. "He is my cousin Pauline's son," she said. "He is a wonderful young man." I stood up. I walked to the counter. I picked up the leather folder. I placed it on the table in front of my mother, and I opened it. Inside were the documents, the restraining order, the lawsuits, the property fraud, the family tree that Arthur had traced, connecting Victor Hale to Margaret Mitchell through the Ashworth bloodline. And at the very bottom, printed on a single white sheet, a photograph of the bruise on my daughter's cheek. I did not raise my voice. I spoke the way I had been trained to speak in rooms where the wrong word could cost lives. Quietly, clearly, with absolute precision. "Victor Hale," I said, "is your cousin's son. He has a history of violence against women. He has a restraining order that was expunged through a legal loophole. He put his hands on my daughter, your granddaughter, the one you never called, the one you never sent a birthday card to, the one whose mother you refused to name, and you put him in her life deliberately." My mother's face drained of color. The paper in her hand trembled. David looked at the table. Yvonne put her hand over her mouth. "That is not," my mother started. I was not finished. "I served this country for 26 years. I said I ran intelligence operations in 4 countries. I carried men out of buildings on fire. And in all of those years, in all of those rooms, I never encountered anyone as coldly calculating as a mother who would use her own granddaughter as a bargaining chip to get access to property she has no claim to." Grace was crying, not loudly. The tears ran down her face in straight lines. She looked at my mother and she said one sentence that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "You knew," Grace said. "You knew who he was the entire time." Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The mask was gone. The control was gone. The carefully folded paper with its 4 demands sat on the table like a receipt for a debt that could never be repaid. Yvonne stood up. She reached for her purse. "Thomas, this is not what we—" I stopped her with a look. "Sit down, Yvonne," I said. "You knew too. Arthur confirmed that the introduction was arranged through your church group in Charlottesville. You introduced Victor to Grace at a fundraiser last spring. You told Grace he was a family friend. You did not tell her he was family." Yvonne sat down slowly. Her face had gone gray. David had not moved. He had not spoken a single word. His silence filled the room the same way it had filled my mother's living room 9 years ago. A coward's consistency. My mother stared at the documents. She stared at the photograph of Grace's bruise. And then she did something I did not expect. Her shoulders dropped, her chin lowered, and a sound came out of her that was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when the structure they have built their entire identity around collapses. A small, choked breath, then another. Her eyes welled up and the tears fell onto the folded paper, smearing the ink of her own demands. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after a mission that lasted too long. Thomas, she whispered. I did not know about the violence. I did not. Maybe not, I said, but you knew he was connected to you. You sent him to my daughter without telling her the truth. And you came here today not to apologize, not to ask about Helen, not to mourn the 9 years you threw away. You came here with a list. The same way you came to my living room 34 years ago with a verdict. You have spent your whole life deciding what other people are worth. Today, I decided what your decisions are worth. I picked up the documents, I closed the folder, and I set it beside my mother's demands. That is your receipt, I said. David and Yvonne left first. David stopped at the door and looked at me for the first time. I should have said something, he said. Back then. I know, I said. My mother stood slowly. She left the folded paper on the table. She walked to the door, and she paused. She looked at the photograph of Helen on the wall, the wedding day photo. Helen in a cream dress, smiling, holding a single white flower. My mother stared at it for a long time. She was beautiful, my mother said quietly. I know, I said. I watched her car pull down the long driveway and disappear past the oak trees. Grace sat at the table for a long time after they left. Neither of us spoke. Bo came and put his head in her lap. She stroked his ears and stared at the empty chairs. I am sorry, she said finally. I did not know. You have nothing to be sorry for, I told her. I sat down beside her and put my arm around her the way I used to when she was small enough to fit entirely in my lap. I should have told you sooner, I said. I thought I was protecting you by keeping the silence. I think your mother's words were right. The truth about a person never hides forever. I was just afraid of how much it would hurt when it finally showed itself. Grace leaned against my shoulder. We sat there until the light outside turned gold and then gray and then dark. The months that followed were slow and quiet and necessary. Grace ended things with Victor completely. She filed a report. Arthur helped her find the right attorney. Victor left Charlottesville. I heard later that he moved out of state. I did not follow up. Some people exit your life, and the only correct response is to let the door close behind them. Grace found a small apartment in Richmond, closer to her school. She painted the walls pale yellow, the same color Helen had painted our first kitchen. She adopted a cat from the shelter and named him Oliver because she said he had a distinguished face. She called me every Sunday. She started coming to Cedar Hollow more often to sit on the porch with Bo and grade papers while I worked in the shop. I joined a breakfast group at the Veterans Hall, 6 men who met every Wednesday morning. We drank bad coffee and told stories we had told 100 times before, and nobody ever asked anyone to explain themselves. Arthur came down once a month. We would sit in the workshop and talk about nothing important and everything that mattered. One Sunday, Grace brought a pie. Pecan, Helen's recipe. She set it on the table and looked at me. I found the recipe card in that box you gave me, she said. Mom's handwriting was still on it. I looked at the pie and my throat tightened so hard I could not speak for a moment. We ate it on the porch. It tasted exactly right. My mother wrote me a letter 3 months later. Plain white envelope. No return address. I recognized the handwriting. It did not contain an apology. Not really. It contained something smaller. She wrote that she had looked at the photograph of Helen every day since she left my house. She wrote that she did not understand how she had become the person she had become. She wrote that Yvonne had not spoken to her since learning the truth about Victor. She wrote that David had moved away without telling her. She wrote that the silence she now lived in was the same silence she had given me for 9 years, and that she finally understood what it weighed. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer beside Helen's recipe cards. I did not write back. Some doors once closed are meant to stay that way, but I did not throw the letter away. When I was young, I believed strength was the ability to endure anything without flinching. War taught me that strength is the willingness to act when action costs you everything. But age taught me the truest lesson of all. Strength is knowing which doors to open and which doors to leave shut. It is loving someone enough to protect them, even when protecting them means letting the people who should have loved them face the full weight of what they chose instead. Helen knew that. She always knew. The truth about a person never hides forever. You just have to be patient enough to let it show itself. Grace came to dinner last Sunday. She brought Oliver the cat, who sat on the porch and watched Bo with aristocratic disdain. She made her mother's fried chicken, and it was almost as good as Helen's. Almost. She told me about a student in her class, a quiet boy who reminded her of me. He builds things, she said, little structures out of popsicle sticks and glue. He does not talk much, but he watches everything. Sounds like a smart kid, I said. She smiled. He is, she said. I think he just needs someone to tell him that being quiet is not the same as being invisible. I looked at my daughter across the table. Helen's eyes, my stubbornness, a heart bigger than either of us deserved. And I thought about all the things that had to break for this moment to exist. A family that chose prejudice over love, a silence that lasted 9 years, a woman who died too soon but left behind wisdom that outlived everything else. A piece of paper with 4 demands that became a mirror held up to the person who wrote them. And a daughter who sat in my kitchen on a Sunday evening teaching me that the ordinary things, a meal, a conversation, a cat glaring at a dog, those are the things worth protecting. Those are the things worth every fight and every scar and every door you had to close to keep them safe. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone who loved you so quietly you almost missed it, share it with them. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And leave me a comment telling me which moment hit you the hardest. Sometimes the people who need these words the most find them because someone like you had the courage to pass them along.